Section 25 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Laurie Anne Walden. Anatomy of the Human Body by Henry Gray, Part 2. Mechanics of Muscle. In studying the mechanical action of muscles, the individual muscle cannot always be treated as a single unit, since different parts of the same muscle may have entirely different actions, as with the pectoralis major, the deltoid, and the trapezius, where the nerve impulses control and stimulate different portions of the muscle in succession or at different times. Most muscles are, however, in a mechanical sense, units. But in either case, the muscle fibers constitute the elementary motor elements. The direction of the muscle pull. In those muscles where the fibers always run in a straight line from origin to insertion in all positions of the joint, a straight line joining the middle of the surface of origin with the middle of the insertion surface will give the direction of the pull. If, however, the muscle or its tendon is bent out of a straight line by a bony process or ligament so that it runs over a pulley-like arrangement, the direction of the muscle pull is naturally bent out of line. The direction of the pull in such cases is from the middle point of insertion to the middle point of the pulley where the muscle or tendon is bent. Muscles, or tendons of muscles, which pass over more than one joint, and pass through more than one pulley, may be resolved, so far as the direction of the pull is concerned, into two or more units or single joint muscles. The tendons of the flexor profundus digitorum, for example, pass through several pulleys formed by fibrous sheaths. The direction of the pull is different for each joint, and varies for each joint according to the position of the bones. The direction is determined in each case, however, by a straight line between the centers of the pulleys on either side of the joint. The direction of the pull in any of the segments would not be altered by any change in the position or origin of the muscle belly above the proximal pulley. The action of the muscle pull on the tendon. Where the muscle fibers are parallel, or nearly parallel, to the direction of the tendon, the entire strength of the muscle contraction acts in the direction of the tendon. In pinnate muscles, however, only a portion of the strength of contraction is efficient in the direction of the tendon, since a portion of the pull would tend to draw the tendon to one side. This is mostly annulled by pressure of surrounding parts. In bipinnate muscles, this lateral pull is counterbalanced. If, for example, the muscle fibers are inserted into the tendon at an angle of 60 degrees, it is easy to determine by the parallelogram of forces that the strength of the pull along the direction of the tendon is equal to 1/2 the muscle pull. Capital T equals tendon, M equals strength and direction of muscle pull, small t equals component acting in the direction of the tendon, phi equals angle of insertion of muscle fibers into tendon. Cosine phi equals small t divided by m, cosine angle 60 degrees equals 0.5. 0.5 equals small t over m, t equals 1/2 m. If phi equals 72 degrees 30 minutes, cosine equals 1/3. If phi equals 41 degrees 20 minutes, cosine equals 3/4. If phi equals 90 degrees, cosine equals 0. If phi equals 0 degrees, cosine equals 1. The more acute the angle phi, that is, the smaller the angle, the greater the component acting in the direction of the tendon pull. At 41 degrees 20 minutes, 3/4 of the pull would be exerted in the direction of the tendon, and at 0 degrees the entire strength. On the other hand, the greater the angle, the smaller the tendon component. At 72 degrees 30 minutes, 1/3 the muscle strength would act in the direction of the tendon, and at 90 degrees the tendon component would be nil. The strength of muscles. The strength of a muscle depends upon the number of fibers in what is known as the physiological cross-section. That is, a section which passes through practically all of the fibers. In a muscle with parallel or nearly parallel fibers which have the same direction as the tendon, this corresponds to the anatomical cross-section. but in unipinnate and bipinnate muscles the physiological cross-section may be nearly at right angles to the anatomical cross-section. Since Huber has shown that muscle fibers in a single fasciculus of a given muscle vary greatly in length, in some fasciculi from 9 mm to 30.4 mm, it is unlikely that the physiological cross-section will pass through all the fibers. Estimates have been made of the strength of muscles, and it is probable that coarse fibred muscles are somewhat stronger per square centimeter of physiological cross-section than are the fine fibred muscles. Fick estimates the average strength as about 10 kilograms per square centimeter. This is known as the absolute muscle strength. The total strength of a muscle would be equal to the number of square centimeters in its physiological cross-section times 10 kilograms. The work accomplished by muscles. For practical uses, this should be expressed in kilogram meters. In order to reckon the amount of work which a muscle can perform under the most favorable conditions, it is necessary to know 1. Its physiological cross-section, 2. The maximum shortening, and 3. The position of the joint when the latter is obtained. Work equals lifted weight times height through which the weight is lifted, or work equals tension times distance. Tension equals physiological cross-section times absolute muscle strength. If a muscle has a physiological cross-section of 5 square centimeters, its tension strength equals 5 times 10, or 50 kilograms. If it shortens 5 centimeters, the work equals 50 times 0.05 equals 2.5 kilogram meters. If one determines then the physiological cross-section and multiplies the absolute muscle strength, 10 kilograms, by this, the amount of tension is easily obtained. Then one must determine only the amount of shortening of the muscle for any particular position of the joint, in order to determine the amount of work the muscle can do, since work equals tension times distance. The tension of a muscle is, however, not constant during the course of contraction, but is continually decreasing during contraction. It is at a maximum at the beginning, and gradually decreases. This can be illustrated by the work diagram. AMD ordinate equals tension. AVX abscissa equals shortening. AD equals tension of muscle in extended or antagonistic position. AV equals amount of actual shortening. AM equals tension in mid-position equals absolute muscle strength. DV shows how the tension sinks from maximum in the extended position of the muscle, where it is about double that in the mid-position, M, to nothing on complete contraction. Delta ADV equals work diagram. In reality, the hypotenuse is not straight, but has a concave curve. The delta has the same area as the rectangle AM M'(V). AM equals the average tension. Work equals AM times AV kilogram meters, if the size of the ordinate is expressed in kilograms and the abscissa in meters. Although the muscle works with a changing tension, yet the accomplishment is the same as if it were contracting with the tension of the mid-position. In reality, the amount of work is somewhat greater, since even in extreme contraction the muscle still retains a certain amount of tension, so that the maximum amount of work is more nearly like ADX. We know that a muscle may have an extreme actual shortening of about 80% of its length when the tendon of insertion is cut. The trapezoid ADSV represents more nearly the amount of work, but since there are only approximate values, and ADSV is not much larger than AM M'(V), we may use the latter. Only the tension and amount of shortening are needed to determine the amount of work of the muscle. Neither the lever arm nor the fiber angle in pinnate muscles need be considered. The diagram shows that the lever arm is of no importance for determining the amount of work the muscle performs. JB and JB1 equals 2 bones jointed at J. CD and EF equal the direction of the pull of 2 muscles of equal cross-section, each having a muscle tension of 1,000 grams. The centers of the attachments are such that perpendiculars J_c and J_e to CD and EF are equal to 40 and 23 mm respectively. J_c equals 40 mm, and J_e equals 23 mm. The static moments are equal to 1000 times 40 and 1000 times 23. Therefore the first muscle can hold a much larger load, L, on the bone JB1 at H1 (100 mm from J) than the second muscle whose load can be designated as L1. Equilibrium exists for the first muscle if L times 100 equals 1000 times 40, or L equals 1000 times 40 over 100 equals 400 grams. For the second muscle, L1 times 100 equals 1000 times 23. L1 equals 1000 times 23 over 100 equals 230 grams. If we suppose JB to be fixed and JB1 to move in the plane of the paper about J, and the muscle CD to shorten 5 mm, C_d equals CD minus 5 mm, and with the tension of 1000 grams, JB1 will take the position JB2, and the load, L, will be lifted from H1 to H2. If the second muscle likewise shortens 5 mm, then E_f equals EF minus 5 mm, and with the tension of 1000 grams, the bone, JB1, will take the position JB3, and the weight or load, L1, will be lifted from H1 to H3. The question now is to prove that the work done is the same in both cases, namely, 5 times 1000 gram millimeters. If so, 400 times H1 H2 equals 230 times H1 H3 equals 5000 gram millimeters. Since the two radii C_d and C_d' are very long as compared with the arc d', we may consider this short arc as a line to CD at d'. Likewise the arc f' may be considered as a straight line to EF. In the same manner we can consider the short arcs F'f, D', H1 H2 and H1 H3 to the line JB1. The sides D', and F', of the delta D', and F', are each 5 mm. The lever arm DJ equals 60 mm, and JF equals 30 mm. The delta D', is similar to the delta D'Cj. Hence D' to 5 is to 60 to 40. D' equals 300 divided by 40. Also H1 H2 to D' as to 100 to 60. H1 H2 to 300 over 40 as to 100 to 60. H1 H2 equals 300 divided by 24. Hence F' to 5 is to 30 to 23. F' equals 150 divided by 23. Also H1 H3 is to F' as to 100 to 30. H1 H3 is to 150 over 23 as 100 to 30. H1 H3 equals 1500 over 69. 400 times 300 divided by 24 equals 230 times 1500 divided by 69 equals 5000. Thus we see that the work of the two muscles depends on the size of the contraction and on the tension, and not on the lever arm in very small contractions, or in the summation of such contractions, and therefore for large contractions. In the first muscle a large load is moved through a short distance, and in the second muscle a lighter load is moved through a greater distance. The amount of work accomplished by pinnate muscles is not dependent upon the angle of insertion of the muscle fibers into the tendon, as will be seen by the following diagram. T prime T equals direction of the tendon pull. WA equals direction of muscle fiber before contraction. M prime equals direction of muscle fiber after contraction. V equals amount of contraction. M equals tension of the muscle. Phi equals angle of insertion of muscle fiber. T equals tendon component equals M times cosine phi equals the weight carried by the tendon to balance the muscle tension. D equals distance tendon is drawn up. 1. M times V equals work done by the muscle fiber. 2. T times D equals work done by the movement of the tendon. If we consider the distance V as being very short, then the line BC can be dealt with as though it were perpendicular to AC. Then V equals D times cosine phi, or D equals V over cosine phi. Since T equals M times cosine phi, or M equals T over cosine phi. M times V equals T over cosine phi times D times cosine phi equals T times D. If this is true for very minute contractions, it is likewise true for a series of such contraction, and hence for larger contractions. If we assume that phi equals 60 degrees, M equals 10 kilograms, and V equals 5 millimeters, the work done by the contracting muscle fiber equals mv, or 10 times 5 kilogram millimeters. Cosine angle 60 degrees equals 1/2, hence T equals 1/2 M, and D equals V over 1/2 equals 2V. 1/2 M equals 5 kilograms, and 2V equals 10 millimeters. Hence TD equals 50 kilogram millimeters, or the work done by the movement of the tendon in lifting the load of 5 kilograms a distance of 10 millimeters, and is exactly the same as that done by the muscle fiber. The load on the tendon is but 1/2 the tension of the muscle, but the distance through which the load is lifted is twice that of the amount of shortening of the muscle. If phi equals 41 degrees 20 minutes, then cosine phi equals 3 over 4. Hence T equals 3/4 M, and D equals 4/3 V, and TD equals MV. In pinnate muscles, then, we have the rather unexpected condition in which the same amount of movement of the tendon can be accomplished with less contraction of the muscle than in muscles where the fibers have the same direction as the tendon. The action of muscles on joints. If we consider now the action of a single muscle extending over a single joint, in which one bone is fixed and the other movable, we will find that muscle pull can be resolved into two components, a turning component and a friction or pressure component, as shown in Fig. 369. dF equals the fixed bone from which the muscle takes its origin. dK equals the movable bone. OI equals a line from the middle of origin to the middle of insertion. IM equals size and direction of the muscle pull. If the parallelogram is constructed with IT and MB perpendicular to DK, then IT equals the turning component, and IB equals the component which acts against the joint. The size of the two components depends upon the insertion angle, phi. The smaller this angle, the smaller the turning component, and the nearer this angle phi is to 90 degrees, the larger the turning component. IT equals IM times sine phi. IB equals IM times cosine phi. If phi equals 90 degrees, cosine phi equals 0, sine phi equals 1, hence IB equals 0, and IT equals IM. If phi equals 0 degrees, cosine phi equals 1, sine phi equals 0, hence IB equals 1, and IT equals 0. With movements of the bone dk, the angle of insertion is continually changing, and hence the two components are changing in value. If, for example, the distance from origin O to the joint D is greater than from D to I, as in the brachialis or biceps muscles, the turning component increases until the insertion angle phi equals 90 degrees, which is the optimum angle for muscle action, while the pressure component gradually decreases. If the movement continues beyond this point, the turning component gradually decreases, and the pressure component changes into a component which tends to draw the two bones apart, and which gradually increases. When the bone DK is in such a position that the insertion angle phi equals 41 degrees 20 minutes, the pressure component equals 3/4 Im, and the turning component 1/4 Im. At 60 degrees the two components are equal. At 90 degrees the pressure component equals 0, and the turning component equals Im, and at 131 degrees 21 minutes the pressure component has been converted into a pulling component equals 1/4 Im, and the turning component equals 3/4 Im. If, for example, the distance from the origin O to the joint D is less than the distance from the insertion I to the joint D, as in the brachioradialis muscle, the insertion angle increases with the flexion but never reaches 90 degrees. The turning component gradually increases to a certain point, and then slowly decreases as shown in Figure 371, while the pressure component gradually decreases and then slowly increases. It always remains large, and its action is always in the direction of the joint. Levers. The majority of the muscles of the body act on bones as the power on levers. Levers of the 3 class are the most common, as the action of the biceps and the brachialis muscles on the forearm bones. Levers of the 1 class are found in movements of the head where the occipito-atlantal joint acts as the fulcrum and the muscles on the back of the neck as the power. Another common example is the foot, when one raises the body by contracting the gastrocnemius and soleus. Here the ankle joint acts as the fulcrum, and the pressure of the toes on the ground as the weight. This is frequently, though wrongly, considered a lever of the 2 class. If one were to stand on one's head with the legs up and with a weight on the plantar surface of the toes, it is easy to see that we would have a lever of the 1 class if the weight were raised by contraction of the gastrocnemius muscle. The confusion has arisen by not considering the fact that the fulcrum and the power in all 3 classes of levers must have a common basis of action, as shown in Figure 372. If the fulcrum rests on the earth, the power must either directly or indirectly push from the earth, or be attached to the earth, either by gravity or otherwise, if it pulls toward the earth. If the power were attached to the weight, no lever action could be obtained. There are no levers of the 2 class represented in the body. End of section 25.
of Gray's Anatomy Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. Development of the muscles. Both the cross-striated and smooth muscles, with the exception of a few that are of ectodermal origin, arise from the mesoderm. The intrinsic muscles of the trunk are derived from the myotomes, while the muscles of the head and limbs differentiate directly from the mesoderm. The myotomic muscles. The intrinsic muscles of the trunk, which are derived directly from the myotomes, are conveniently treated in 2 groups, the deep muscles of the back and the thoraco-abdominal muscles. The deep muscles of the back extend from the sacral to the occipital region and vary much in length and size. They act chiefly on the vertebral column. The shorter muscles, such as the interspinalis, intertransversarii, the deeper layers of the multifidus, the rotatores, levatores costarum, obliquus capitis inferior, obliquus capitis superior, and rectus capitis posterior minor, which extend between the adjoining vertebrae, retain the primitive segmentation of the myotomes. Other muscles, such as the splenius capitis, splenius cervicis, sacrospinalis, semispinalis, multifidus, iliocostalis, longissimus, spinalis, semispinalis, and rectus capitis posterior major, which extend over several vertebrae, are formed by the fusion of successive myotomes and the splitting into longitudinal columns. The fascia lumbodorsalis develops between the true myotomic muscles and the more superficial ones which migrate over the back, such as the trapezius, rhomboideus, and latissimus. The anterior vertebral muscles, the longus colli, longus capitis, rectus capitis anterior, and rectus capitis lateralis, are derived from the ventral part of the cervical myotomes, as are probably also the scaleni. The thoraco-abdominal muscles arise through the ventral extension of the thoracic myotomes into the body wall. This process takes place coincident with the ventral extension of the ribs. In the thoracic region, the primitive myotomic segments still persist as the intercostal muscles. But over the abdomen, these ventral myotomic processes fuse into a sheet which splits in various ways to form the rectus, the obliquus externus and internus, and the transversalis. Such muscles as the pectoralis major and minor and the serratus anterior do not belong to the above group. The ventrolateral muscles of the neck. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue, the infrahyoid muscles, and the diaphragm are derived from a more or less continuous premuscle mass which extends on each side from the tongue into the lateral region of the upper half of the neck, and into it early extend the hypoglossal and branches of the upper cervical nerves. The two halves which form the infrahyoid muscles and the diaphragm are at first widely separated from each other by the heart. As the latter descends into the thorax, the diaphragmatic portion of each lateral mass is carried with its nerve down into the thorax, and laterally placed infrahyoid muscles move towards the midventral line of the neck. Muscles of the shoulder girdle and arm. The trapezius and sternocleidomastoid arise from a common premuscle mass in the occipital region, just caudal to the last branchial arch. As the mass increases in size, it spreads downward to the shoulder girdle, to which it later becomes attached. It also spreads backward and downward to the spinous processes, gaining attachment at the still later period. The levator scapulae, serratus anterior, and the rhomboids arise from premuscle tissue in the lower cervical region and undergo extensive migration. The latissimus dorsi and teres major are associated in their origin from the premuscle sheath of the arm, as are also the two pectoral muscles when the arm bud lies in the lower cervical region. The intrinsic muscles of the arm develop in situ from the mesoderm of the arm bud, and probably do not receive cells or buds from the myotomes. The nerves enter the arm bud when it still lies in the cervical region, and as the arm shifts caudally over the thorax, the lower cervical nerves which unite to form the brachial plexus acquire a caudal direction. The muscles of the leg. The muscles of the leg, like those of the arm, develop in situ from the mesoderma of the leg bud, the myotomes apparently taking no part in their formation. The muscles of the head. The muscles of the orbit arise from the mesoderm over the dorsal and caudal sides of the optic stalk. The muscles of mastication arise from the mesoderm of the mandibular arch. The mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve enters this premuscle mass before it splits into the temporal, masseter, and pterygoideus. The facial muscles, muscles of expression, arise from the mesoderm of the hyoid arch. The facial nerve enters this mass before it begins to split, and as the muscle mass spreads out over the face and head and neck, it splits more or less incompletely into the various muscles. The early differentiation of the muscular system apparently goes on independently of the nervous system, and only later does it appear that muscles are dependent on the functional stimuli of the nerves for their continued existence and growth. Although the nervous system does not influence muscle differentiation, the nerves, owing to their early attachments to the muscle rudiments, are in a general way indicators of the position of origin of many of the muscles, and likewise, in many instances, the nerves indicate the paths along which the developing muscles have migrated during development. The muscle of the diaphragm, for example, has its origin in the region of the fourth and fifth cervical segments. The phrenic nerve enters the muscle mass while the latter is in this region, and is drawn out as the diaphragm migrates through the thorax. The trapezius and sternocleidomastoids arise in the lateral occipital region as a common muscle mass, into which, at a very early period, the nervus accessoris extends, and as the muscle mass migrates and extends caudally, the nerve is carried with it. The pectoralis major and minor arise in the cervical region, receive their nerves while in this position, and, as the muscle mass migrates and extends caudally over the thorax, the nerves are carried along. The latissimus dorsi and serratus anterior are excellent examples of migrating muscles, whose nerve supply indicates their origin in the cervical region. The rectus abdominis and the other abdominal muscles migrate or shift from a lateral to a ventrolateral or abdominal position, carrying with them the nerves. The facial nerve, which early enters the common facial muscle mass of the second branchial or hyoid arch, is dragged about with the muscle as it spreads over the head and face and neck, and as the muscle splits into the various muscles of expression, the nerve is correspondingly split. The mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve enters at an early time the muscle mass in the mandibular arch, and as this mass splits and migrates apart to form the muscles of mastication, the nerve splits into its various branches. The nerve supply then serves as a key to the common origin of certain groups of muscles. The muscles supplied by the oculomotor nerve arise from a single mass in the eye region. The lingual muscles arise from a common mass supplied by the hypoglossal nerve. Striped or voluntary muscle. Striped or voluntary muscle is composed of bundles of fibers, each enclosed in a delicate web called the perimysium, in contradistinction to the sheath of areolar tissue which invests the entire muscle, the epimysium. The bundles are termed fasciculi. They are prismatic in shape, of different sizes in different muscles, and are for the most part placed parallel to one another, though they have a tendency to converge towards their tendinous attachments. Each fasciculus is made up of a strand of fibers, which also run parallel with each other, and are separated from one another by a delicate connective tissue derived from the perimysium and termed endomysium. This does not form the sheath of fibers, but serves to support the blood vessels and nerves ramifying between them. A muscle fiber may be said to consist of a soft contractile substance enclosed in a tubular sheath named by Momin the sarcolemma. The fibers are cylindrical or prismatic in shape and are of no great length, not exceeding, as a rule, 40 millimeters. Huber has recently found that the muscle fibers in the adductor muscle of the thigh of the rabbit vary greatly in length, even in the same fasciculus. In a fasciculus 40 millimeters in length, the fibers varied from 30.4 millimeters to 9 millimeters in length. Their breadth varies in man from 0.01 to 0.1 millimeters. As a rule, the fibers do not divide or anastomose, but occasionally, especially in the tongue and facial muscles, they may be seen to divide into several branches. In the substance of the muscle, the fibers end by tapering extremities which are joined to the ends of other fibers by the sarcolemma. At the tendinous end of the muscle, the sarcolemma appears to blend with a small bundle of fibers into which the tendon becomes subdivided, while the muscular substance ends abruptly and can be readily made to retract from the point of junction. The areolar tissue between the fibers appears to be prolonged more or less into the tendon, so as to form the kind of sheath around the tendon bundles for a longer or shorter distance. When muscle fibers are attached to skin or mucous membranes, their fibers become continuous with those of the areolar tissue. The sarcolemma, or tubular sheath of the fiber, is a transparent, elastic, and apparently homogeneous membrane of considerable toughness, so that it sometimes remains entire when the included substance is ruptured. On the internal surface of the sarcolemma in mammalia, and also in the substance of the fiber in frogs, elongated nuclei are seen, and in connection with these is a little granular protoplasm. Upon examination of a voluntary muscle fiber by transmitted light, it is found to be marked by alternate light and dark bands or striae, which pass transversely across the fiber. When examined by polarized light, the dark bands are found to be doubly refracting, anisotropic, while the clear stripes are single refracting, isotropic. The dark and light bands are of nearly equal breadth and alternate with great regularity. They vary in breadth from about 1 to 2 microns. If the surface be carefully focused, rows of granules will be detected at the points of junction of the dark and light bands, and very fine longitudinal lines may be seen running through the dark bands and joining these granules together. By treating the specimen with certain reagents, for example chloride of gold, fine lines may be seen running transversely between the granules and uniting them together. This appearance is believed to be due to a reticulum or network of interstitial substance lying between the contractile portions of the muscle. The longitudinal striation gives the fiber the appearance of being made up of a bundle of fibers which have been termed sarcostyles or muscle columns, and if the fiber be hardened in alcohol, it can be broken up longitudinally and the sarcostyles separated from each other. The reticulum, with its longitudinal and transverse meshes, is called sarcoplasm. In a transverse section, the muscle fiber is seen to be divided into a number of areas called the areas of Cohnheim, more or less polyhedral in shape and consisting of the transversely divided sarcostyles surrounded by transparent sarcoplasm. Upon closer examination, and by somewhat altering the focus, the appearances become more complicated and are susceptible of various interpretations. The transverse striation, which appears as a mere alternating of dark and light bands, is resolved into the appearance which shows a series of broad dark bands separated by light bands, each of which is divided into two by a dark dotted line. This line is termed Dobbe's line or Krauss's membrane because it was believed by Krauss to be an actual membrane continuous with the sarcolemma and dividing the light band into two compartments. In addition to the membrane of Krauss, fine clear lines may be made out with a sufficiently high power crossing the center of the dark band. These are known as the lines of Henson. Schaefer has worked out the minute anatomy of muscle fiber, particularly in the wing muscle of insects, which are peculiarly adapted for this purpose on account of the large amount of interstitial sarcoplasm which separates the sarcostyles. In the following description, that given by Schaefer will be closely followed. A sarcostyle may be said to be made up of succession portions, each of which is termed a sarcomere. The sarcomere is situated between two membranes of Krauss and consists of 1. A central dark part, which forms a portion of the dark band of the whole fiber and is named a sarcous element. This sarcous element really consists of two parts, superimposed one on top of the other, and when the fiber is stretched, these two parts become separated from each other at the line of Henson. 2. On either side of this central dark portion is a clear layer, most visible when the fiber is extended. This is situated between the dark center and the membrane of Krauss, and when the sarcomeres are joined together to form the sarcostyle, constitutes the light band of the striated muscle fiber. When the sarcostyle is extended, the clear intervals are well marked and plainly to be seen. When, on the other hand, the sarcostyle is contracted, that is to say when the muscle is in the state of contraction, these clear portions are very small, or they may have disappeared altogether. When the sarcostyle is stretched to its full extent, not only is the clear portion well marked, but the dark portion, the sarcous element, is separated into its two constituents along the line of Henson. The sarcous element does not lie free in the sarcomere, for when the sarcostyle is stretched so as to render the clear portion visible, very fine lines, which are probably septa, may be seen running through it from the sarcous element to the membrane of Krauss. Schaefer explains these phenomena in the following way. He considers that each sarcous element is made up of a number of longitudinal channels, which open into the clear part towards the membrane of Krauss, but are closed at the line of Henson. When the muscular fiber is contracted, the clear part of the muscular substance is driven into these channels or tubes, and is therefore hidden from sight. But at the same time, it swells up the sarcous element and widens and shortens the sarcomere. When, on the other hand, the fiber is extended, this clear substance is driven out of the tubes and collects between the sarcous elements and the membrane of Krauss, and gives the appearance of the light part between these two structures. By this means, it elongates and narrows the sarcomere. If this view be true, it is a matter of great interest, and, as Schaefer has shown, harmonizes the contraction of muscle with the amoeboid action of protoplasm. In an amoeboid cell, there is a framework of spongioplasm which stains with hematoxylin and similar reagents, enclosing in its meshes a clear substance, hyaloplasm, which will not stain with these reagents. Under stimulation, the hyaloplasm passes into the pores of the spongioplasm. Without stimulation, it tends to pass out, as in the formation of pseudopodia. In muscle, there is the same thing, that is, a framework of spongioplasm staining with hematoxylin, the substance of the sarcous element, and this encloses a clear hyaloplasm, the clear substance of the sarcomere, which resists staining with this reagent. During contraction of the muscle, that is stimulation, this clear substance passes into the pores of the spongioplasm, while during extension of the muscle, that is when there's no stimulation, it tends to pass out of the spongioplasm. In this way, the contraction is brought about. Under stimulation, the protoplasmic material, the clear substance of the sarcomere, recedes into the sarcous elements, causing the sarcomere to widen out and shorten. The contraction of the muscle is merely the sum total of this widening out and shortening of these bodies. Vessels and nerves of striped muscle. The capillaries of striped muscles are very abundant and form a sort of rectangular network, the branches of which run longitudinally in the endomysium between the muscle fibers, and are joined at short intervals by transverse anastomosing branches. In the red muscles of the rabbit, dilatations occur on the transverse branches of the capillary network. The larger vascular channels, arteries and veins, are found only in the perimysium, between the muscular fasciculi. Nerves are profusely distributed to striped muscle. Their mode of termination is described on page 730. The existence of lymphatic vessels in striped muscle has not been ascertained, though they have been found in tendons and in the sheaths of muscles. Ossification of muscular tissue as a result of repeated strain or injury is not infrequent. It is oftenest found about the tendon of the adductor longus and vastus medialis in horsemen, or in the pectoralis major and deltoideus of soldiers. It may take the form of exostoses firmly fixed to the bone, for example, quote, rider's bone, end quote, on the femur, or of layers or spicules of bone lying in the muscles or their fascia and tendons. Bucy states that these bony deposits are preceded by a hemorrhagic myositis due to injury, the effused blood organizing and being finally converted into bone. In the rarer disease, progressive myositis ossificans, there is an unexplained tendency for practically any of the voluntary muscles to become converted into solid and brittle bony masses, which are completely rigid. End of section 26. Recording by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, www.frontalcortex.com.
Section 27 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2 by Henry Gray. Tendons, aponeuroses, and fasciae. Tendons are white, glistening, fibrous cords, varying in length and thickness, sometimes round, sometimes flattened, and devoid of elasticity. They consist almost entirely of white fibrous tissue, the fibrils of which have an undulating course parallel with each other, and are firmly united together. When boiled in water, tendon is almost completely converted into gelatin, the white fibres being composed of the albuminoid collagen, which is often regarded as the anhydride of gelatin. They are very sparingly supplied with blood vessels, the smaller tendons presenting in their interior no trace of them. Nerves supplying tendons have special modifications of their terminal fibres, named organs of Golgi. Aponeuroses are flattened or ribbon-shaped tendons of a pearly white colour, iridescent, glistening, and similar in structure to the tendons. They are only sparingly supplied with blood vessels. The tendons and aponeuroses are connected, on the one hand with the muscles, and on the other hand with the movable structures, such as the bones, cartilages, ligaments, and fibrous membranes, for instance, the sclera. Where the muscular fibres are in a direct line with those of the tendon or aponeurosis, the two are directly continuous. But where the muscular fibres join the tendon or aponeurosis at an oblique angle, they end, according to Kolliker, in rounded extremities which are received into the corresponding depressions on the surface of the latter, the connective tissue between the muscular fibres being continuous with that of the tendon. The latter mode of attachment occurs in all the peniform and bipeniform muscles, and in those muscles the tendons of which commence in a membranous form, as the gastrocnemius and soleus. The fasciae are fibro-areolar or aponeurotic laminae, of variable thickness and strength, found in all regions of the body, investing the softer and more delicate organs. During the process of development, many of the cells of the mesoderm are differentiated into bones, muscles, vessels, etc., The cells of the mesodome, which are not so utilized, form an investment for these structures and are differentiated into the true skin and the fasciae of the body. They have been subdivided from the situations in which they occur into superficial and deep. The superficial fascia is found immediately beneath the integument over almost the entire surface of the body. It connects the skin with the deep fascia and consists of fibroareolar tissue, containing in its meshes pellicles of fat in varying quantity. Fibroareolar tissue is composed of white fibres and yellow elastic fibres intercrossing in all directions, and united together by a homogeneous cement or ground substance, the matrix. The cells of areolar tissue are of four principal kinds. 1. Flattened lamellar cells, which may be either branched or unbranched. The branched lamellar cells are composed of clear cytoplasm and contain oval nuclei. The processes of these cells may unite so as to form an open network, as in the cornea. The unbranched cells are joined edge to edge like the cells of an epithelium. The tendon cells, presently to be described, are examples of this variety. 2. Plasmatocytes, large irregular cells characterized by the presence of granules or vacuoles in their protoplasm and containing oval nuclei. 3. Granule cells, Mastzellen, which are ovoid or spheroidal in shape. They are formed of a soft protoplasm containing granules which are basophil in character. 4. Plasma cells of Waldeyer, usually spheroidal and distinguished by containing a vacuolated protoplasm. The vacuoles are filled with fluid, and the protoplasm between the spaces is clear, with occasionally a few scattered basophil granules. In addition to these four typical forms of connective tissue corpuscles, areolar tissue may be seen to possess wandering cells, i.e. leukocytes, which have emigrated from the neighbouring vessels. In some instances, as in the choroid coat of the eye, cells filled with granules of pigment cells, are found. The cells lie in spaces in the ground substance between the bundles of fibres, and these spaces may be brought into view by treating the tissue with nitrate of silver and exposing it to the light. This will colour the ground substance and leave cell spaces unstained. Fat is entirely absent in the subcutaneous tissue of the eyelids, of the penis and scrotum, and of the labia minora. It varies in thickness in different parts of the body. In the groin it is so thick that it may be subdivided into several laminae. Beneath the fatty layer there is generally another layer of superficial fascia, comparatively devoid of adipose tissue, in which the trunks of the subcutaneous vessels and nerves are found, as the superficial epigastric vessels in the abdominal region, the superficial veins in the forearm, the saphenous veins in the leg and thigh, and the superficial lymph glands. Certain cutaneous muscles are also situated in the superficial fascia, as the platysma in the neck, and the Orbicularis Oculi around the eyelids. This fascia is most distinct at the lower part of the abdomen, perineum, and extremities. It is very thin in those regions where muscular fibres are inserted into the integument, as on the side of the neck, the face, and around the margin of the anus. It is very dense in the scalp, in the palms of the hands and soles of the feet, forming a fibro-fatty layer which binds the integument firmly to the underlying structures. The superficial fascia connects the skin to the subjacent parts, facilitates the movement of the skin, serves as a soft nidus for the passage of vessels and nerves to the integument, and retains the warmth of the body, since the fat contained in its areolae is a bad conductor of heat. The deep fascia is a dense, inelastic, fibrous membrane, forming sheaths for the muscles, and in some cases affording them broad surfaces for attachment. It consists of shining tendinous fibres, placed parallel with one another, and connected together by other fibres disposed in a rectilinear manner. It forms a strong investment which not only binds down collectively the muscles in each region, but gives a separate sheath to each, as well as to the vessels and nerves. The fasciae are thick in unprotected situations, as on the lateral side of a limb, and thinner on the medial side. The deep fasciae assist the muscles in their actions by the degree of tension and pressure they make upon their surfaces. The degree of tension and pressure is regulated by the associated muscles, as, for instance, by the tensor fasciae latae and gluteus maximus in the thigh, by the biceps in the upper and lower extremities, and palmaris longus in the hand. In the limbs the fasciae not only invest the entire limb, but give off septa which separate the various muscles, and are attached to the periosteum. These prolongations of fasciae are usually spoken of as intermuscular septa. The fasciae and muscles may be arranged, according to the general division of the body, into those of the head and neck, of the trunk, of the upper extremity, and of the lower extremity. End of section 27. Section 28 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2 by Henry Gray. Muscles of the Scalp, Eyelid and Nose. 4. The fasciae and muscles of the head. A. The muscles of the scalp. Epicranius. The skin of the scalp. This is thicker than in any other part of the body. It is intimately adherent to the superficial fascia, which attaches it firmly to the underlying aponeurosis and muscle. Movements of the muscle move the skin. The hair follicles are very closely set together and extend throughout the whole thickness of the skin. It also contains a number of sebaceous glands. The superficial fascia in the cranial region is a firm, dense, fibrofatty layer, intimately adherent to the integument, and to the epicranius and its tendinous aponeurosis. It is continuous behind with the superficial fascia at the back of the neck and, laterally, is continued over the temporal fascia. It contains between its layers the superficial vessels and nerves and much granular fat. The epicranius, occipital frontalis, is a broad, muscular fibrous layer which covers the whole of one side of the vertex of the skull from the occipital bone to the eyebrow. It consists of two parts, the occipitalis and the frontalis, connected by an intervening tendinous aponeurosis, the galea aponeurotica. The occipitalis, thin and quadrilateral in form, arises by tendinous fibres from the lateral 2/3 of the superior nuchal line of the occipital bone and from the mastoid part of the temporal. It ends in the galea aponeurotica. The frontalis is thin, of a quadrilateral form and intimately adherent to the superficial fascia. It is broader than the occipitalis and its fibres are longer and paler in colour. It has no bony attachments. Its medial fibres are continuous with those of the procerus. Its immediate fibres blend with the Cola Gator and Orbicularis Oculi, and its lateral fibres are also blended with the latter muscle over the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. From these attachments the fibres are directed upward, and join the galea aponeurotica below the coronal suture. The medial margins of the frontalis are joined together for some distance above the root of the nose, but between the occipitalis there is a considerable, though variable interval, occupied by the galea aponeurotica. The galea aponeurotica, epicranial aponeurosis, covers the upper part of the cranium. Behind it is attached, in the interval between its union with the occipitalis, to the external occipital protuberance and highest nuchal lines of the occipital bone. In front, it forms a short and narrow prolongation between its union with the frontalis. On either side it gives origin to the auricularies anterior and superior. In this situation it loses its aponeurotic character, and is continued over the temporal fascia to the zygomatic arch as a layer of laminated areolar tissue. It is closely connected to the integument by the firm, dense, fibrofatty layer which forms the superficial fascia of the scalp. It is attached to the pericranium by loose cellular tissue, which allows the aponeurosis, carrying with it the integument, to move through a considerable distance. Variations. Both frontalis and occipitalis vary considerably in size and in extent of attachment. Either may be absent. Fusion of the frontalis to skin has been noted. Nerves. The frontalis is supplied by the temporal branches of the facial nerve, and the occipitalis by the posterior auricular branch of the same nerve. Actions. The frontalis raise the eyebrows and the skin over the root of the nose, and at the same time draw the scalp forward, throwing the integument of the forehead into transverse wrinkles. The occipitalis draw the scalp backward. By bringing alternately into action the frontalis and occipitalis, the entire scalp may be moved forward and backward. In the ordinary action of the muscles, the eyebrows are elevated, and at the same time the aponeurosis is fixed by the occipitalis, thus giving the face the expression of surprise. If the action be exaggerated, the eyebrows are still further raised, and the skin of the forehead thrown into transverse wrinkles, as in the expression of fright or horror. A thin, muscular slip, the transversus nuchae, is present in a considerable proportion, 25%, of cases. It arises from the external occipital protuberance or from the superior nuchal line, either superficial or deep to the trapezius. It is frequently inserted with the auricularis posterior, but may join the posterior edge of the sternocleidomastoideus. 4b. The muscles of the eyelid. The muscles of the eyelids are levator palpebrae superioris, orbicularis oculi, corrugator. The levator palpebrae superioris is described with the anatomy of the eye. The orbicularis oculi, orbicularis palpebrarum, arises from the nasal part of the frontal bone, from the frontal process of the maxilla in front of the lacrimal groove, and from the anterior surface and borders of a short fibrous band, the medial palpebral ligament. From this origin the fibres are directed lateralward, forming a broad and thin layer, which occupies the eyelids of palpebrae, surrounds the circumference of the orbit, and spreads over the temple and downward on the cheek. The palpebral portion of the muscle is thin and pale. It arises from the bifurcation of the medial palpebral ligament, forms a series of concentric curves, and is inserted into the lateral palpebral raphe. The orbital portion is thicker and of a reddish colour. Its fibres form a complete ellipse without interruption at the lateral palpebral commissure. The upper fibres of this portion blend with frontalis and corrugator. The lacrimal part, tensor tarsi, is a small thin muscle, about 6 mm in breadth and 12 mm in length, situated behind the medial palpebral ligament and lacrimal sac. It arises from the posterior crest and adjacent part of the orbital surface of the lacrimal bone, and, passing behind the lacrimal sac, divides into two slips, upper and lower, which are inserted into the superior and inferior tarsi medial to the puncta lacrimalia. Occasionally it is very indistinct. The medial palpebral ligament, tendo oculi, about 4 mm in length and 2 mm in breadth, is attached to the frontal process of the maxilla in front of the lacrimal groove. Crossing the lacrimal sac, it divides into two parts, upper and lower, each attached to the medial end of the corresponding tarsus. As the ligament crosses the lacrimal sac, a strong aponeurotic lamina is given off from its posterior surface. This expands over the sac and is attached to the posterior lacrimal crest. The lateral palpebral raphe is a much weaker structure than the medial palpebral ligament. It is attached to the margin of the frontosphenoidal process of the zygomatic bone, and passes medialward to the lateral commissure of the eyelids, where it divides into two slips, which are attached to the margins of the respective tarsi. The corrugator. Note 79. The corrugator is not recognized as a separate muscle in the basal nomenclature. End of note 79. Corrugator supercilii is a small, narrow, pyramidal muscle placed at the medial end of the eyebrow, beneath the frontalis and orbicularis oculi. It arises from the medial end of the superciliary arch, and its fibres pass upward and lateralward between the palpebral and orbital portions of the orbicularis oculi, and are inserted into the deep surface of the skin above the middle of the orbital arch. Nerves. The orbicularis oculi and corrugator are supplied by the facial nerve. Actions. The orbicularis oculi is the sphincter muscle of the eyelids. The palpebral portion acts involuntarily, closing the lids gently, as in sleep or in blinking. The orbital portion is subject to the will. When the entire muscle is brought into action, the skin of the forehead, temple, and cheek is drawn toward the medial angle of the orbit, and the eyelids are firmly closed, as in photophobia. The skin thus drawn upon is thrown into folds, especially radiating from the lateral angle of the eyelids. These folds become permanent in old age, and form the so-called crow's feet. The levator palpebrae superioris is the direct antagonist of this muscle. It raises the upper eyelid and exposes the front of the bulb of the eye. Each time the eyelids are closed through the action of the orbicularis, the medial palpebral ligament is tightened. The wall of the lacrimal sac is thus drawn lateralward and forward, so that a vacuum is made in it and the tears are sucked along the lacrimal canals into it. The lacrimal part of the Orbicularis Oculi draws the eyelids and the ends of the lacrimal canals medialward and compresses them against the surface of the globe of the eye, thus placing them in the most favourable situation for receiving the tears. It also compresses the lacrimal sac. The Cola Gator draws the eyebrow downward and medialward, producing the vertical wrinkles of the forehead. It is the frowning muscle, and may be regarded as the principal muscle in the expression of suffering. 4c. The muscles of the nose. The muscles of the nose comprise procerus, nasalis, Depressor Cepti, dilator naris posterior, dilator naris anterior. The procerus, pyramidalis nasi, is a small pyramidal slip arising by tendinous fibres from the fascia covering the lower part of the nasal bone and upper part of the lateral nasal cartilage. It is inserted into the skin over the lower part of the forehead between the two eyebrows, its fibres decussating with those of the frontalis. The nasalis compressor naris consists of two parts, transverse and alar. The transverse part arises from the maxilla above and lateral to the incisive fossa. Its fibres proceed upward and medialward, expanding into a thin aponeurosis which is continuous on the bridge of the nose with that of the muscle of the opposite side, and with the aponeurosis of the procerus. The alar part is attached by one end to the greater alar cartilage, and by the other to the integument at the point of the nose. The Depressor Cepti, Depressor alae nasi, arises from the incisive fossa of the maxilla. Its fibres ascend to be inserted into the septum and back part of the alar of the nose. It lies between the mucous membrane and muscular structure of the lip. The dilator naris posterior is placed partly beneath the quadratus labii superioris. It arises from the margin of the nasal notch of the maxilla, and from the lesser alar cartilages, and is inserted into the skin near the margin of the nostril. The dilator naris anterior is a delicate fasciculus, passing from the greater alar cartilage to the integument near the margin of the nostril. It is situated in front of the preceding. Variations. These muscles vary in size and strength, or may be absent. Nerves. All the muscles of this group are supplied by the facial nerve. Actions. The procerus draws down the medial angle of the eyebrows and produces transverse wrinkles over the bridge of the nose. The two dilatores enlarge the aperture of the nares. Their action in ordinary breathing is to resist the tendency of the nostrils to close from atmospheric pressure, but in difficult breathing, as well as in some emotions, such as anger, they contract strongly. The Depressor Cepti is a direct antagonist of the other muscles of the nose, drawing the alar of the nose downward, and thereby constricting the aperture of the nares. The nasalis depresses the cartilaginous part of the nose and draws the alar toward the septum. End of section 28. Section 29 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2 by Henry Gray. Muscles of the Mouth. 4d. The muscles of the mouth. The muscles of the mouth are quadratus labii superioris, quadratus labii inferioris, caninus, triangularis, zygomaticus, buccinator, mentalis, orbicularis oris, risorius. The quadratus labii superioris is a broad sheet, the origin of which extends from the side of the nose to the zygomatic bone. Its medial fibres form the angular head, which arises by a pointed extremity from the upper part of the frontal process of the maxilla, and passing obliquely downward and lateralward divides into two slips. One of these is inserted into the greater alar cartilage and skin of the nose. The other is prolonged into the lateral part of the upper lip, blending with the infraorbital head and with the orbicularis oris. The intermediate portion or infraorbital head arises from the lower margin of the orbit immediately above the infraorbital foramen, some of its fibres being attached to the maxilla, others to the zygomatic bone. Its fibres converge, to be inserted into the muscular substance of the upper lip between the angular head and the caninus. The lateral fibres, forming the zygomatic head, arise from the malar surface of the zygomatic bone immediately behind the zygomatico-maxillary suture and pass downward and medialward to the upper lip. The caninus, levator anguli oris, arises from the canine fossa, immediately below the infraorbital foramen. Its fibres are inserted into the angle of the mouth, intermingling with those of the zygomaticus, triangularis, and orbicularis oris. The zygomaticus major, arises from the zygomatic bone, in front of the zygomatico-temporal suture, and descending obliquely with a medial inclination, is inserted into the angle of the mouth, where it blends with the fibres of the caninus, orbicularis oris, and triangularis. Nerves. This group of muscles is supplied by the facial nerve. Actions. The quadratus labii superioris is the proper elevator of the upper lip, carrying it at the same time a little forward. Its angular head acts as a dilator of the nares. The infraorbital and zygomatic heads assist in forming the nasolabial furrow, which passes from the side of the nose to the upper lip and gives to the face an expression of sadness. When the whole muscle is in action, it gives to the countenance an expression of contempt and disdain. The quadratus labii superioris raises the angle of the mouth and assists the caninus in producing the nasolabial furrow. The zygomaticus draws the angle of the mouth backward and upward, as in laughing. The mentalis, levator menti, is a small conical fasciculus, situated at the side of the frenulum of the lower lip. It arises from the incisive fossa of the mandible, and descends to be inserted into the integument of the chin. The quadratus labii inferioris, depressor labii inferioris, quadratus menti, is a small quadrilateral muscle. It arises from the oblique line of the mandible, between the symphysis and the mental foramen. It passes upward and medialward, to be inserted into the integument of the lower lip, its fibres blending with the orbicularis oris and with those of its fellow of the opposite side. At its origin it is continuous with the fibres of the platysma. Much yellow fat is intermingled with the fibres of this muscle. The triangularis, Depressor Anguli Oris, arises from the oblique line of the mandible, whence its fibres converge, to be inserted, by a narrow fasciculus, into the angle of the mouth. At its origin it is continuous with the platysma, and at its insertion with the orbicularis oris and risorius, some of its fibres are directly continuous with those of the caninus, and others are occasionally found crossing from the muscle of one side to that of the other. These latter fibres constitute the transversus menti. Nerves. This group of muscles is supplied by the facial nerve. Actions. The mentalis raises and protrudes the lower lip, and at the same time wrinkles the skin of the chin, expressing doubt or disdain. The quadratus labii inferioris draws the lower lip directly downward and a little lateralward, as in the expression of irony. The triangularis depresses the angle of the mouth, being the antagonist of the caninus and the zygomaticus. Acting with the caninus, it will draw the angle of the mouth medialward. The platysma, which retracts and depresses the angle of the mouth, belongs with this group. The buccinator is a thin quadrilateral muscle, occupying the interval between the maxilla and the mandible at the side of the face. It arises from the outer surfaces of the alveolar processes of the maxilla and mandible, corresponding to the 3 molar teeth, and behind from the anterior border of the pterygomandibular raphe, which separates it from the constrictor pharyngis superior. The fibres converge toward the angle of the mouth, where the central fibres intersect each other, those from below being continuous with the upper segment of the orbicularis oris, and those from above with the lower segment. The upper and lower fibres are continued forward into the corresponding lip without decussation. Relations. The buccinator is covered by the buccopharyngeal fascia, and is in relation by its superficial surface, behind, with a large mass of fat, which separates it from the ramus of the mandible, the masseter, and a small portion of the temporalis. This fat has been named the suctorial pad, because it is supposed to assist in the act of sucking. The parotid duct pierces the buccinator opposite the second molar tooth of the maxilla. The deep surface is in relation with the buccal glands and mucous membrane of the mouth. The pterygomandibular raphe, pterygomandibular ligament, is a tendinous band of the buccopharyngeal fascia, attached by one extremity to the hamulus of the medial pterygoid plate, and by the other to the posterior end of the mylohyoid line of the mandible. Its medial surface is covered by the mucous membrane of the mouth. Its lateral surface is separated from the ramus of the mandible by a quantity of adipose tissue. Its posterior border gives an attachment to the constrictor pharyngis superior, its anterior border to part of the buccinator. The Orbicularis oris is not a simple sphincter muscle like the Orbicularis Oculi. It consists of numerous strata of muscular fibres surrounding the orifice of the mouth but having different direction. It consists partly of fibres derived from the other facial muscles which are inserted into the lips, and partly of fibres proper to the lips. Of the former, a considerable number are derived from the buccinator and form the deeper stratum of the orbicularis. Some of the buccinator fibres, namely those near the middle of the muscle, decussate at the angle of the mouth, those arising from the maxilla passing to the lower lip, and those from the mandible to the upper lip. The uppermost and lowermost fibres of the buccinator pass across the lips from side to side without decussation. Superficial to this stratum is a second, formed on either side by the caninus and triangularis, which cross each other at the angle of the mouth, those from the caninus passing to the lower lip, and those from the triangularis to the upper lip, along which they run, to be inserted into the skin near the median line. In addition to these, there are fibres from the quadratus labii superioris, the zygomaticus, and the quadratus labii inferioris. These intermingle with the transverse fibres above described, and have principally an oblique direction. The proper fibres of the lips are oblique, and pass from the under surface of the skin to the mucous membrane through the thickness of the lip. Finally, there are fibres by which the muscle is connected with the maxillae and the septum of the nose above, and with the mandible below. In the upper lip these consist of two bands, lateral and medial, on either side of the middle line. The lateral band, musculus incisivus labii superioris, arises from the alveolar border of the maxilla, opposite the lateral incisor tooth, and arching lateralward it is continuous with the other muscles at the angle of the mouth. The medial band, musculus nasolabialis, connects the upper lip to the back of the septum of the nose. The interval between the two medial bands corresponds with a depression, called the philtrum, seen on the lip beneath the septum of the nose. The additional fibres for the lower lip constitute a slip, musculus incisivus labii inferioris, on either side of the middle line. This arises from the mandible, lateral to the mentalis, and intermingles with the other muscles at the angle of the mouth. The risorius arises in the fascia over the masseter and, passing horizontally forward, superficial to the platysma, is inserted into the skin at the angle of the mouth. It is a narrow bundle of fibres, broadest at its origin, but varies much in its size and its form. Variations. The zygomatic head of the quadratus labii superioris and risorius are frequently absent, and more rarely the zygomaticus. The zygomaticus and risorius may be doubled, or the latter greatly enlarged or blended with the platysma. Nerves. The muscles in this group are all supplied by the facial nerve. Actions. The Orbicularis oris in its ordinary action affects the direct closure of the lips, by its deep fibres. Assisted by the oblique ones, it closely applies the lips to the alveolar arch. The superficial part, consisting principally of the decussating fibres, brings the lips together and also protrudes them forward. The buccinators compress the cheeks, so that, during the process of mastication, the food is kept under the immediate pressure of the teeth. When the cheeks have been previously distended with air, the buccinator muscles expel it from between the lips, as in blowing a trumpet. Hence the name, buccina, a trumpet. The risorius retracts the angle of the mouth and produces an unpleasant grinning expression. For more extensive consideration of the facial muscles, see Charles Darwin, Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. End of section 29.
Of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lawrence. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. The Muscles of Mastication. The chief muscles of mastication are Masseter, Temporalis, Pterygoidus externus, and Pterygoidus internus. Parotidiomasseteric Fascia. Masseteric Fascia. Covering the masseter, and firmly connected with it, is a strong layer of fascia derived from the deep cervical fascia. Above, this fascia is attached to the lower border of the zygomatic arch, and behind it invests the parotid gland. The masseter is a thick, somewhat quadrilateral muscle consisting of two portions, superficial and deep. The superficial portion, the larger, arises by a thick tendinous aponeurosis from the zygomatic process of the maxilla, and from the anterior 2/3 of the lower border of the zygomatic arch. Its fibers pass downward and backward, to be inserted into the angle and lower half of the lateral surface of the ramus of the mandible. The deep portion is much smaller and more muscular in texture. It arises from the posterior third of the lower border and from the whole of the medial surface of the zygomatic arch. Its fibers pass downward and forward, to be inserted into the upper half of the ramus and the lateral surface of the coronoid process of the mandible. The deep portion of the muscle is partially concealed, in front, by the superficial portion. Behind, it is covered by the parotid gland. The fibers of the two portions are continuous at their insertion. Temporal Fascia. The temporal fascia covers the temporalis muscle. It is a strong, fibrous investment, covered laterally by the auricularis anterior and superior by the Galea aponeurotica, and by part of the Orbicularis Oculi. The superficial temporal vessels and the auriculotemporal nerve cross it from below upward. Above, it is a single layer attached to the entire extent of the superior temporal line, but below, where it is fixed to the zygomatic arch, it consists of two layers, one of which is inserted into the lateral, and the other into the medial border of the arch. A small quantity of fat, the orbital branch of the superficial temporal artery, and a filament from the zygomatic branch of the maxillary nerve, are contained between these two layers. It affords attachment by the deep surface to the superficial fibers of the temporalis. The temporalis, temporal muscle, is a broad radiating muscle situated at the side of the head. It arises from the whole of the temporal fossa, except that portion of it which is formed by the zygomatic bone, and from the deep surface of the temporal fascia. Its fibers converge as they descend, and end in a tendon, which passes deep into the zygomatic arch, and is inserted into the medial surface, apex, and anterior border of the coronoid process, and the anterior border of the ramus of the mandible nearly as far forward as the last molar tooth. The Pterygoidus externus, external pterygoid muscle, is a short, thick muscle, somewhat conical in form, which extends almost horizontally between the infratemporal fossa and the condyle of the mandible. It arises by two heads, an upper from the lower part of the lateral surface of the great wing of the sphenoid and from the infratemporal crest, a lower from the lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate. Its fibers pass horizontally backward and lateralward, to be inserted into a depression in front of the neck of the condyle of the mandible, and into the front margin of the anticular disc of the temporomandibular articulation. The Pterygoidus internus, internal pterygoid muscle, is a thick quadrilateral muscle. It arises from the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate and the groove surface of the pyramidal process of the palatine bone. It has a second slip of origin from the lateral surfaces of the pyramidal process of the palatine and tuberosity of the maxilla. Its fibers pass downward, lateralward, and backward, and are inserted by a strong tendinous lamina into the lower and back part of the medial surface of the ramus and angle of the mandible, as high as the mandibular foramen. Nerves. The muscles of mastication are supplied by the mandibular nerve. Actions. The temporalis, masseter, and pterygoideus internus raise the mandible against the maxillae with great force. The pterygoideus externus assists in opening the mouth, but its main action is to draw forward the condyle and articular disc so that the mandible is protruded and the inferior incisors projected in front of the upper. In this action it is assisted by the pterygoideus internus. The mandible is retracted by the posterior fibers of the temporalis. If the pterygoidea internus and externus of one side act, the corresponding side of the mandible is drawn forward, while the opposite condyle remains comparatively fixed, and side-to-side movements, such as occur during the trituration of food, take place. End of section 30. Recorded by David Lawrence in Brampton, Ontario, January 3rd, 2009.
of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. Superficial cervical muscle. 5. The fascia and muscles of the anterolateral region of the neck. A. The superficial cervical muscle. The anterolateral muscles of the neck may be arranged into the following groups: 1. Superficial cervical. 2. Lateral cervical. 3. Supra and infrahyoid. 4. Anterior vertebral. 5. Lateral vertebral. The superficial cervical muscle. Platysma. The superficial fascia of the neck is a thin lamina investing the platysma and is hardly demonstrable as a separate membrane. The platysma is a broad sheet arising from the fascia covering the upper parts of the pectoralis major and deltoideus. Its fibers cross the clavicle and proceed obliquely upward and medialward along the side of the neck. The anterior fibers interlace below and behind the symphysis mentae with the fibers of the muscle of the opposite side. The posterior fibers cross the mandible, some being inserted into the bone below the oblique line, others into the skin and subcutaneous tissue of the lower part of the face, many of these fibers blending with the muscles about the angle and lower part of the mouth. Sometimes fibers can be traced to the zygomaticus or to the margin of the Orbicularis Oculi. Beneath the platysma, the external jugular vein descends from the angle of the mandible to the clavicle. Variations occur in the extension over the face and over the clavicle and shoulder. It may be absent or interdigitate with the muscle of the opposite side in front of the neck. Attachment to clavicle, mastoid process, or occipital bone occurs. A more or less independent fasciculus, the occipitalis minor, may extend from the fascia over the trapezius to fascia over the insertion of the sternocleidomastoideus. Nerve. The platysma is supplied by the cervical branch of the facial nerve. Actions. When the entire platysma is in action, it produces a slight wrinkling of the surface of the skin of the neck in an oblique direction. Its anterior portion, the thickest part of the muscle, depresses the lower jaw. It also serves to draw down the lower lip and angle of the mouth in the expression of melancholy. 5b. The lateral cervical muscles. The lateral muscles are trapezius and sternocleidomastoideus. The fascia colli, deep cervical fascia. The fascia colli lies under cover of the platysma and invests the neck. It also forms sheaths for the carotid vessels and for the structures situated in front of the vertebral column. The investing portion of the fascia is attached behind to the ligamentum nuchae and to the spinous process of the seventh cervical vertebra. It forms a thin investment to the trapezius, and at the anterior border of this muscle is continued forward as a rather loose areolar layer covering the posterior triangle of the neck to the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus, where it begins to assume the appearance of a fascial membrane. Along the hinder edge of the sternocleidomastoideus it divides to enclose the muscle, and at the anterior margin again forms a single lamella, which covers the anterior triangle of the neck and reaches forward to the middle line, where it is continuous with the corresponding part from the opposite side of the neck. In the middle line of the neck it is attached to the symphysis mentae and the body of the hyoid bone. Above. The fascia is attached to the superior nuchal line of the occipital, to the mastoid process of the temporal, and to the whole length of the inferior border of the body of the mandible. Opposite the angle of the mandible the fascia is very strong, and binds the anterior edge of the sternocleidomastoideus firmly to that bone. Between the mandible and the mastoid process it ensheaths the parotid gland. The layer which covers the gland extends upward under the name of the parotidiomasseteric fascia, and is fixed to the zygomatic arch. From the part which passes under the parotid gland a strong band extends upward to the styloid process, forming the stylomandibular ligament. Two other bands may be defined, the sphenomandibular and the pterygospinous ligaments. The pterygospinous ligament stretches from the upper part of the posterior border of the lateral pterygoid plate to the spinous process of the sphenoid. It occasionally ossifies, and in such cases, between its upper border and the base of the skull, a foramen is formed which transmits the branches of the mandibular nerve to the muscles of mastication. Below. The fascia is attached to the acromion, the clavicle, and the manubrium sterni. Some little distance above the last it splits into two layers, superficial and deep. The former is attached to the anterior border of the manubrium, the latter to its posterior border and to the interclavicular ligament. Between these two layers is a slit-like interval, the suprasternal space, space of Burns. It contains a small quantity of areolar tissue, the lower portions of the anterior jugular veins and their transverse connecting branch, the sternal heads of the sternocleidomastoidea, and sometimes a lymph gland. The fascia which lines the deep surface of the sternocleidomastoideus gives off the following processes. 1. A process envelops the tendon at the omohyoideus and binds it down to the sternum and first costal cartilage. 2. A strong sheath, the carotid sheath, encloses the carotid artery, internal jugular vein, and vagus nerve. 3. The prevertebral fascia extends medialward behind the carotid vessels, where it assists in forming their sheath, and passes in front of the prevertebral muscles. It forms the posterior limit of a fibrous compartment, which contains the larynx and trachea, the thyroid gland, and the pharynx and esophagus. The prevertebral fascia is fixed above to the base of the skull, and below is continued into the thorax in front of the longus colli muscles. Parallel to the carotid sheath and along its medial aspect, the prevertebral fascia gives off a thin lamina, the buccopharyngeal fascia, which closely invests the constrictor muscles of the pharynx and is continued forward from the constrictor pharyngees superior onto the buccinator. It is attached to the prevertebral layer by loose connective tissue only, and thus an easily distended space, the retropharyngeal space, is found between them. This space is limited above by the base of the skull, while below it extends behind the esophagus into the posterior mediastinal cavity of the thorax. The prevertebral fascia is prolonged downward and lateralward behind the carotid vessels and in front of the scalenii, and forms a sheath for the brachial nerves and subclavian vessels in the posterior triangle of the neck. It is continued under the clavicle as the axillary sheath, and is attached to the deep surface of the coracoclavicular fascia. Immediately above and behind the clavicle, an areolar space exists between the investing layer and the sheath of the subclavian vessels, and in this space are found the lower part of the external jugular vein, the descending clavicular nerves, the transverse scapular and transverse cervical vessels, and the inferior belly of the omohyoideus muscle. This space is limited below by the fusion of the coracoclavicular fascia with the anterior wall of the axillary sheath. 4. The pretracheal fascia extends medially in front of the carotid vessels, and assists in forming the carotid sheath. It is continued behind the depressor muscles of the hyoid bone, and after enveloping the thyroid gland, is prolonged in front of the trachea to meet the corresponding layer of the opposite side. Above it is fixed to the hyoid bone, while below it is carried downward in front of the trachea and large vessels at the root of the neck, and ultimately blends with the fibrous pericardium. This layer is fused on either side with the prevertebral fascia, and with it completes the compartment containing the larynx and trachea, the thyroid gland, and the pharynx and esophagus. Footnote: F. G. Parsons, Journal of Anatomy and Physiology, Volume 44, regards the carotid sheath and the fascial planes in the neck as structures which are artificially produced by dissection. End of footnote. The sternocleidomastoideus, sternomastoid muscle, passes obliquely across the side of the neck. It is thick and narrow at its central part, but broader and thinner at either end. It arises from the sternum and clavicle by two heads. The medial or sternal head is a rounded fasciculus, tendinous in front, fleshy behind, which arises from the upper part of the anterior surface of the manubrium sterni, and is directed upward, lateralward, and backward. The lateral or clavicular head, composed of fleshy and aponeurotic fibers, arises from the superior border and anterior surface of the medial third of the clavicle. It is directed almost vertically upward. The two heads are separated from one another at their origins by a triangular interval, but gradually blend, below the middle of the neck, into a thick, rounded muscle, which is inserted by a strong tendon into the lateral surface of the mastoid process, from its apex to its superior border, and by a thin aponeurosis into the lateral half of the superior nuchal line of the occipital bone. Variations. The sternocleidomastoideus varies much in the extent of its origin from the clavicle. In some cases the clavicular head may be as narrow as the sternal. In others it may be as much as 7.5 cm in breadth. When the clavicular origin is broad, it is occasionally subdivided into several slips, separated by narrow intervals. More rarely the adjoining margins of the sternocleidomastoideus and trapezius have been found in contact. The supraclavicularis muscle arises from the manubrium behind the sternocleidomastoideus and passes behind the sternocleidomastoideus to the upper surface of the clavicle. Triangles of the neck. This muscle divides the quadrilateral area of the side of the neck into two triangles, an anterior and a posterior. The boundaries of the anterior triangle are, in front, the median line of the neck; above, the lower border of the body of the mandible, and an imaginary line drawn from the angle of the mandible to the sternocleidomastoideus; behind, the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus. The apex of the triangle is at the upper border of the sternum. The boundaries of the posterior triangle are, in front, the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus, below, the middle third of the clavicle, behind, the anterior margin of the trapezius. The apex corresponds with the meeting of the sternocleidomastoideus and trapezius on the occipital bone. The anatomy of these triangles will be more fully described with that of the vessels of the neck. Nerves. The sternocleidomastoideus is supplied by the accessory nerve and branches from the anterior divisions of the second and third cervical nerves. Actions. When only one sternocleidomastoideus acts, it draws the head toward the shoulder of the same side, assisted by the splenius and the obliquus capitis inferior of the opposite side. At the same time it rotates the head so as to carry the face toward the opposite side. Acting together from their sternoclavicular attachments, the muscles will flex the cervical part of the vertebral column. If the head be fixed, the two muscles assist in elevating the thorax in forced inspiration. End of section 31. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Section 32 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. Section 32. The supra- and infrahyoid muscles. The suprahyoid muscles are digastricus, stylohyoideus, mylohyoideus, geniohyoideus. The digastricus, digastric muscle, consists of two fleshy bellies united by an intermediate rounded tendon. It lies below the body of the mandible and extends in a curved form from the mastoid process to the symphysis mentae. The posterior belly, longer than the anterior, arises from the mastoid notch of the temporal bone and passes downward and forward. The anterior belly arises from a depression on the inner side of the lower border of the mandible, close to the symphysis, and passes downward and backward. The two bellies end in an intermediate tendon which perforates the stylohyoideus muscle and is held in connection with the side of the body and the greater cornu of the hyoid bone by a fibrous loop, which is sometimes lined by a mucous sheath. A broad aponeurotic layer is given off from the tendon of the digastricus on either side to be attached to the body and greater cornu of the hyoid bone. This is termed the suprahyoid aponeurosis. Variations are numerous. The posterior belly may arise partly or entirely from the styloid process, or may be connected by a slip to the middle or inferior constrictor. The anterior belly may be double, or extra slips from this belly may pass to the jaw or mylohyoideus, or decussate with a similar slip on the opposite side. Anterior belly may be absent, and posterior belly inserted into the middle of the jaw or hyoid bone. The tendon may pass in front, more rarely behind, the stylohyoideus. The mentohyoideus muscle passes from the body of hyoid bone to chin. The digastricus divides the anterior triangle of the neck into three smaller triangles. One, the submaxillary triangle, bounded above by the lower border of the body of the mandible and a line drawn from its angle to the sternocleidomastoideus. Below by the posterior belly of the digastricus and the stylohyoideus, in front of the anterior belly of the digastricus. 2. The carotid triangle, bounded above by the posterior belly of the digastricus and stylohyoideus, behind by the sternocleidomastoideus, below by the omohyoideus. 3. The suprahyoid or submental triangle, bounded laterally by the anterior belly of the digastricus, medially by the middle line of the neck from the hyoid bone to the symphysis mentae, and inferiorly by the body of the hyoid bone. The stylohyoideus, stylohyoid muscle, is a slender muscle lying in front of and above the posterior belly of the digastricus. It arises from the back and lateral surface of the styloid process near the base, and passing downward and forward is inserted into the body of the hyoid bone. at its junction with the greater cornu, and just above the omohyoideus. It is perforated near its insertion by the tendon of the digastricus. Variations. It may be absent or doubled, lie beneath the carotid artery, or be inserted into the omohyoideus, thyreohyoideus, or mylohyoideus. The stylohyoid ligament, ligamentum stylohyoideus. In connection with the stylohyoideus muscle, a ligamentous band, the stylohyoid ligament, may be described. It is a fibrous cord, which is attached to the tip of the styloid process of the temporal and the lesser cornu of the hyoid bone. It frequently contains a little cartilage in its center, is often partially ossified, and in many animals forms a distinct bone, the epihyal. The mylohyoideus, mylohyoid muscle, flat and triangular, is situated immediately above the anterior belly of the digastricus, and forms, with its fellow of the opposite side, a muscular floor for the cavity of the mouth. It arises from the whole length of the mylohyoid line of the mandible, extending from the symphysis in front to the last molar tooth behind. The posterior fibers pass medialward and slightly downward, to be inserted into the body of the hyoid bone. The middle and anterior fibers are inserted into a median fibrous raphe extending from the symphysis mentae to the hyoid bone, where they join at an angle with the fibers of the opposite muscle. This median raphe is sometimes wanting, the fibers of the two muscles are then continuous. Variations. It may be united to or replaced by the anterior belly of the digastricus. Accessory slips to other hyoid muscles are frequent. The geniohyoideus, geniohyoid muscle, is a narrow muscle situated above the medial border of the mylohyoideus. It arises from the inferior mental spine on the back of the symphysis mentae, and it runs backward and slightly downward to be inserted into the anterior surface of the body of the hyoid bone. It lies in contact with its fellow of the opposite side. Variations. It may be blended with the one on opposite side or double. Slips to greater cornu of hyoid bone and genioglossus occur. Nerves. The mylohyoideus and anterior belly of the digastricus are supplied by the mylohyoid branch of the inferior alveolar, the stylohyoideus and posterior belly of the digastricus by the facial, the geniohyoideus by the hypoglossal. Actions. These muscles perform two very important actions. During the act of glutition, they raise the hyoid bone, and with it the base of the tongue. When the hyoid bone is fixed by its depressors and those of the larynx, they depress the mandible. During the first act of deglutition, when the mass of food is being driven from the mouth into the pharynx, the hyoid bone, and with it the tongue, is carried upward and forward by the anterior bellies of the digastrici, the mylohyoidei and geniohyoidei. In the second act, when the mass is passing through the pharynx, the direct elevation of the hyoid bone takes place by the combined action of all the muscles, and after the food has passed, the hyoid bone is carried upward and backward by the posterior bellies of the digastrici and stylohyoidei, which assist in preventing the return of the food into the mouth. The infrahyoid muscles are sternohyoideus, sternothyreoideus, thyreohyoideus, omohyoideus. The sternohyoideus, sternohyoid muscle, is a thin, narrow muscle, which arises from the posterior surface of the medial end of the clavicle, the posterior sternoclavicular ligament, and the upper and posterior part of the manubrium sterni. Passing upward and medialward, it is inserted by short tendinous fibers into the lower border of the body of the hyoid bone. Below, this muscle is separated from its fellow by a considerable interval, but the two muscles come into contact with one another in the middle of their course, and from this upward lie side by side. It sometimes presents immediately above its origin a transverse tendinous inscription. Variations. Doubling, accessory slips, cleidohyoideus. Absence. The sternothyreoideus, sternothyroid muscle, is shorter and wider than the preceding muscle, beneath which it is situated. It arises from the posterior surface of the manubrium sterni, below the origin of the sternohyoideus, and from the edge of the cartilage of the first rib, and sometimes that of the second rib. It is inserted into the oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. This muscle is in close contact with its fellow at the lower part of the neck, but diverges somewhat as it ascends. It is occasionally traversed by a transverse or oblique tendinous inscription. Variations: doubling, absence, accessory slips of the thyreohyoideus, inferior constrictor, or carotid sheath. The thyreohyoideus, thyrohyoid muscle, is a small quadrilateral muscle appearing like an upward continuation of the sternothyreoideus. It arises from the oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage and is inserted into the lower border of the greater cornu of the hyoid bone. The omohyoideus, omohyoid muscle, consists of two fleshy bellies united by a central tendon. It arises from the upper border of the scapula and occasionally from the superior transverse ligament which crosses the scapular notch, its extent of attachment to the scapula varying from a few millimeters to 2.5 centimeters. From this origin, the inferior belly forms a flat, narrow fasciculus, which inclines forward and slightly upward across the lower part of the neck. Being bound down to the clavicle by a fibrous extension, it then passes behind the sternocleidomastoideus, becomes tendinous, and changes its direction, forming an obtuse angle. It ends in the superior belly, which passes almost vertically upward, close to the lateral border of the sternohyoideus, to be inserted into the lower border of the body of the hyoid bone, lateral to the insertion of the sternohyoideus. The central tendon of this muscle varies much in length and form, and is held in position by a process of the deep cervical fascia, which sheaths it, and is prolonged down to be attached to the clavicle and first rib. It is by this means that the angular form of the muscle is maintained. Variations: doubling, absence, origin from clavicle, absence or doubling of either belly. The inferior belly of the omohyoideus divides the posterior triangle of the neck into an upper or occipital triangle and a lower or subclavian triangle, while its superior belly divides the anterior triangle into an upper or carotid triangle and a lower or muscular triangle. Nerves. The infrahyoid muscles are supplied by branches from the first three cervical nerves. From the first two nerves the branch joins the hypoglossal trunk, runs with it some distance, and sends off a branch to the thyreohyoideus. It then leaves the hypoglossal to form the descendens hypoglossae, and unites with the communicantis cervicalis from the second and third cervical nerves to form the ansa hypoglossii, from which nerves pass to the other infrahyoid muscles. Actions. These muscles depress the larynx and hyoid bone, after they have been drawn up with the pharynx in the act of deglutition. The omohyoidei not only depress the hyoid bone, but carry it backward and to one or the other side. They are concerned especially in prolonged inspiratory efforts, for by rendering the lower part of the cervical fascia tense, they lessen the inward suction of the soft parts, which would otherwise compress the great vessels and the apices of the lungs. The thyreohyoideus may act as an elevator of the thyroid cartilage when the hyoid bone ascends, drawing the thyroid cartilage up behind the hyoid bone. The sternothyreoideus acts as a depressor of the thyroid cartilage. End of section 32.